The air inside the grand hall was thick with anticipation. The soft hum of whispered conversations blended with the gentle melody of a string quartet. Chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, casting a warm glow on the polished marble floors. Every detail of the wedding was meticulously planned, an event straight out of a fairy tale. Amelia stood at the altar, her hands trembling slightly as they rested in Richard's. She looked stunning in an ivory gown that hugged her silhouette, delicate lace trailing down her arms. Her heart pounded, not with nerves, but with overwhelming joy. This was the moment she had dreamed of, a future with the man she loved. Richard gazed at her with unwavering devotion, his deep blue eyes filled with a quiet promise. He gave her fingers a reassuring squeeze. "You're everything I've ever wanted," he whispered. The officiant cleared his throat, signaling the beginning of the vows. And then, a child's voice rang through the air, cutting through the solemnity like a knife. "Daddy!" A ripple of gasps spread across the hall. The soft murmurs turned into audible confusion. Amelia's grip on Richard's hands faltered, her stomach clenched. She turned her head instinctively toward the voice. Standing at the entrance of the grand room was a boy, no older than 6, dressed in a miniature tuxedo. His golden curls framed a delicate face. His wide, striking blue eyes locked onto Richard's with a mixture of confusion and expectation. Beside him, a woman stood with tense shoulders, gripping the child's hand. Her auburn waves cascaded over her shoulders, her emerald green dress shimmering under the chandeliers. The way she held herself, rigid yet determined, sent an eerie chill down Amelia's spine. The whispers among the guests swelled into a crescendo of hushed speculation. Amelia's breath came in short, uneven bursts. Her fingers, now ice-cold, slipped away from Richard's grasp. Richard stood frozen, his face drained of color. His mouth parted, but no words came out. His entire body seemed locked in place, as if time itself had halted. The boy, still standing near the doorway, took a hesitant step forward, his small fingers tightening around the woman's hand. He looked up at her for reassurance before turning back to Richard. "Why didn't you tell me?" The woman's voice was steady yet thick with emotion. "Why didn't you tell her?" Amelia's pulse thundered in her ears, the room around her blurred, the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths pressed against her chest. Her mind raced through possibilities, desperately searching for an explanation, a reason, something that would make this moment make sense. Her fiancé, the man she loved, the man she had built her future around. Did he have a child? And had he lied to her all this time? The silence between them stretched, thick with unanswered questions and unbearable tension. Richard inhaled sharply, as if finally remembering how to breathe. His gaze darted between the woman, the child, and Amelia. His lips pressed together, his brows knitted in turmoil. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Amelia took a slow step backward. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Richard, what have you done?" The streets of her childhood smelled of warm bread and damp earth. The tiny village where Amelia grew up was quiet, nestled between rolling green hills that stretched far beyond what her young eyes could see. Life had always been simple, predictable. Her mother, a seamstress, spent long nights bent over a wooden table, sewing dresses for wealthier women. Her father, a kind but weary man, worked in the fields until the sun dipped below the horizon. They had little, but they had each other, and to Amelia that had always been enough until it wasn't. She was 16 when everything changed. A sudden illness took her mother first. Her father followed soon after, leaving her alone in a world that did not wait for grief. She left the village with nothing but a suitcase filled with old memories and a heart too heavy for her young age. The city was nothing like home, loud, restless, indifferent. She found work as a waitress in a small cafe, where long hours and aching feet became her new normal. But Amelia had always been a dreamer. At night, she would sit by the window of her tiny apartment, watching the city lights flicker like fallen stars. She imagined a different life, a future where she wasn't struggling to make rent, where she didn't have to count every coin before buying groceries. She dreamed of love, the kind that wasn't just about survival, but about belonging. And then she met Richard. It had been a night like any other. She was serving drinks at an exclusive event, weaving through a crowd of elegantly dressed guests. That was when she saw him. Tall, composed, with an effortless grace that made people turn their heads. His presence commanded the room, yet his eyes, a deep shade of blue, held something else, something unreadable. She hadn't expected him to notice her, but he did. At first it was polite conversation, casual, fleeting. Then came small gestures. He would visit the cafe where she worked, always choosing a table near the window. He would ask about her day, listen in a way that made her feel seen. No man had ever looked at her the way Richard did. Weeks turned into months, and their connection deepened. He introduced her to a world she had only ever glimpsed from the outside. Private dinners, weekend getaways, whispered promises under dimmed city lights. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, life had something beautiful in store for her. But there were things about Richard that she didn't understand. He never spoke of his past. Whenever she asked about his family, his childhood, he would change the subject or offer vague answers. There were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when a shadow crossed his face, a heaviness he carried but never acknowledged. She chose not to question it. After all, wasn't everyone allowed their secrets? She had spent her whole life yearning for stability, for love, and now, with Richard, she had both, or so she thought. The streets of her childhood smelled of warm bread and damp earth. The tiny village where Amelia grew up was quiet, nestled between rolling green hills that stretched far beyond what her young eyes could see. Life had always been simple, predictable. Her mother, a seamstress, spent long nights bent over a wooden table, sewing dresses for wealthier women. Her father, a kind but weary man, worked in the fields until the sun dipped below the horizon. They had little, but they had each other, and to Amelia that had always been enough. Until it wasn't. She was 16 when everything changed. A sudden illness took her mother first. Her father followed soon after, leaving her alone in a world that did not wait for grief. She left the village with nothing but a suitcase filled with old memories and a heart too heavy for her young age. The city was nothing like home, loud, restless, indifferent. She found work as a waitress in a small cafe where long hours and aching feet became her new normal. But Amelia had always been a dreamer. At night she would sit by the window of her tiny apartment, watching the city lights flicker like fallen stars. She imagined a different life, a future where she wasn't struggling to make rent, where she didn't have to count every coin before buying groceries. She dreamed of love, the kind that wasn't just about survival, but about belonging. And then she met Richard. It had been a night like any other. She was serving drinks at an exclusive event, weaving through a crowd of elegantly dressed guests. That was when she saw him, tall, composed, with an effortless grace that made people turn their heads. His presence commanded the room, yet his eyes, a deep shade of blue, held something else, something unreadable. She hadn't expected him to notice her, but he did. At first it was polite conversation, casual, fleeting. Then came small gestures. He would visit the cafe where she worked, always choosing a table near the window. He would ask about her day, listen in a way that made her feel seen. No man had ever looked at her the way Richard did. Weeks turned into months, and their connection deepened. He introduced her to a world she had only ever glimpsed from the outside. Private dinners, weekend getaways, whispered promises under dimmed city lights. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, life had something beautiful in store for her. But there were things about Richard that she didn't understand. He never spoke of his past. Whenever she asked about his family, his childhood, he would change the subject or offer vague answers. There were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when a shadow crossed his face, a heaviness he carried but never acknowledged. She chose not to question it. After all, wasn't everyone allowed their secrets? She had spent her whole life yearning for stability, for love, and now, with Richard, she had both. Or so she thought. The life Richard lived was nothing like hers. Where Amelia had known struggle, he had known privilege. Where she had fought for every opportunity, doors had always opened effortlessly for him. At least, that was how it seemed. To the world, Richard was the definition of success, a self-made millionaire, a brilliant businessman, a man who turned everything he touched into gold. But Amelia had seen the cracks beneath the polished surface. He rarely spoke of his family. When he did, it was brief, almost mechanical. His parents had passed away years ago. He had no siblings, and he had built his empire on his own. That was all he ever said. But Amelia sensed there was more. Something left unsaid, something locked away behind the composed mask he wore so well. Still, she didn't push. What mattered was the way he made her feel. When he held her, she felt safe. When he looked at her, she felt like the only woman in the world. He was charming, attentive, devoted. And when he asked her to marry him, there was no hesitation in her answer. The proposal had been nothing short of magical. A weekend getaway to the Amalfi coast, a candle-lit dinner on a secluded terrace overlooking the ocean, the warm evening air carrying the scent of jasmine. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he had taken her hand, slipped a stunning diamond ring onto her finger, and whispered, "Marry me." She had said yes without a second thought. The months that followed were a whirlwind of preparations. Richard insisted on the best of everything, the finest venue, the most exquisite dress, a guest list filled with the most influential names. "This is our day," he had told her. "I want it to be perfect." And it was. At least until it wasn't. Looking back, there had been signs, fleeting moments when Richard seemed lost in thought, his usual confidence momentarily replaced by something else. Doubt, regret, fear. She wasn't sure. And she hadn't asked, because she had been happy. And when you are happy, you don't go looking for shadows. The morning of the wedding had been calm. Excitement hummed in the air as Amelia stepped into her gown, her reflection in the mirror almost unrecognizable. The girl from the small village, the girl who had spent years struggling to survive, was now a bride, about to marry the man of her dreams. As she walked down the aisle, all she saw was Richard. And the way he looked at her, his eyes shining with something intense, something unreadable, made her believe that whatever ghosts haunted him, they didn't matter. She was wrong. The wedding was nothing short of breathtaking. A grand ballroom, its ceiling adorned with shimmering chandeliers, cast a golden glow over the guests. White roses and soft candlelight decorated every corner, their scent mingling with the crisp air of a perfect evening. Every detail had been meticulously planned, every moment crafted to perfection. Amelia stood before the towering doors, her fingers curled tightly around the bouquet in her hands. Beyond them, her future awaited. She inhaled deeply. This was it. The doors swung open and all eyes turned to her. A hush fell over the room as she stepped forward, her gown gliding over the polished marble floor. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, but her gaze was fixed only on one person, Richard. He stood at the altar, tall and composed, his black tuxedo perfectly tailored to his frame. His blue eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment it felt like they were the only two people in the room. Her heart pounded. As she reached him, he took her hands, his grip firm, grounding. The warmth of his touch melted away any lingering nerves. "You're beautiful," he murmured, his voice just for her. She smiled, her heart swelling. The officiant began speaking, his words a gentle hum beneath the rush of blood in her ears. She barely registered them, too lost in the certainty that this was where she was meant to be. Then, just as Richard opened his mouth to say his vows, a child's voice pierced the air. "Daddy?" The room shifted. The carefully curated moment shattered into a million pieces. The bouquet slipped from Amelia's fingers. A murmur spread through the guests, confused whispers filling the silence. Her breath hitched as she turned toward the voice. A boy no older than 6 stood at the entrance, his small frame dwarfed by the grand doorway. He was dressed in a miniature tuxedo, his golden curls unruly, his blue eyes, Richard's eyes, wide with uncertainty. Beside him, a woman stood frozen, her grip firm on the boy's hand. Her auburn hair cascaded over her shoulders, her emerald dress shimmering under the chandeliers. There was something unreadable in her gaze, pain, hesitation, resolve. Amelia's pulse pounded. Richard's hands fell away from hers. The hush in the room grew heavier. The boy took a hesitant step forward. "Daddy," he repeated, softer this time, his voice filled with a quiet longing. Richard remained silent. Amelia turned to him, her heart in her throat. "Richard," she whispered. "Who is he?" Richard didn't answer. The woman's voice sliced through the tension. "Richard, this is your son, and it's time you told her the truth." The silence was deafening. Amelia felt the world tilting beneath her feet, her pulse thundering in her ears. The weight of the words, his son, hung in the air like an unbearable truth pressing against her chest. Richard stood frozen, his expression unreadable. The guests whispered, their murmurs an indistinct hum, but all Amelia could focus on was the little boy. He looked at Richard with innocent expectation, his small hands curled into fists at his sides. Amelia took a step back. "Richard!" Her voice was barely a whisper. Richard finally exhaled as if breaking free from an invisible grip. His gaze flickered to the woman beside the child, the mother. "Elena," he said, his voice rough. So, he knew her. The woman's jaw tightened. "I gave you time, Richard," she said, her voice laced with something between sadness and anger. "I waited. But you never told her." Amelia's stomach twisted. "Told me what?" Richard's lips parted, but no words came. Elena let out a bitter breath. 6 years, Richard. He's 6 years old and you never told her about him." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The weight of the revelation pressed down on Amelia like a collapsing building. 6 years. Richard had a son, and he had kept it from her. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the fabric of her dress. The man she loved, the man she had trusted, had lied to her. Not just about something, about everything. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of everyone. Richard finally found his voice. "I didn't know." Elena's eyes flashed. "You didn't want to know." The little boy's gaze darted between them, confusion evident in his innocent face. "Daddy?" His voice was softer now, uncertain. Amelia's heart clenched. She turned to Richard. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Did you know?" He swallowed hard. "Not like this. Not like this. Not like this." A bitter laugh bubbled in her throat. "Then how, Richard?" Her voice cracked. "How exactly was I supposed to find out?" He reached for her, desperation in his eyes, but she stepped back. She had been ready to vow her life to this man, to build a future with him. But now she didn't even know who he was. Richard's mind reeled, the weight of Elena's words pressing down on him like a vice. The little boy, his son, stood in the middle of a storm he never should have been caught in. Amelia's eyes, once filled with love, now held something far colder. Betrayal. "Elena," he started, his voice raw. "I swear, I didn't know." Elena shook her head, a bitter smile on her lips. "You didn't ask." Amelia let out a shaky breath. "So that's it," she whispered. "You had a child, and you never thought to look back." Richard ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting. "It wasn't like that." "Then explain it to me," Amelia snapped, her voice rising, the pain evident in every syllable. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like that." His shoulders tensed. He turned to Eleanor. "Why now? Why tell me here, like this?" Eleanor's expression hardened. "Because I ran out of time." A silence stretched between them. Richard's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "I'm sick, Richard." Her voice wavered, but she kept going. "And I can't do this alone anymore." A chill passed through him. "I don't want your money," she continued. "I don't want anything from you, except this. You need to step up. He needs you." The little boy's fingers twitched against her dress. His wide blue eyes darted between them, searching for something he didn't understand. Amelia pressed a trembling hand to her lips. The weight of the truth, of everything unfolding in front of her, was suffocating. Richard felt the walls closing in. The life he had built, the future he had promised Amelia, was crumbling before his eyes. He looked at her, desperate. "Amelia, please." But she shook her head. She had always known Richard carried secrets. She just never imagined this. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't even know who you are." Then she turned and walked away. Amelia didn't remember how she made it out of the venue. One moment she was standing at the altar. and the next she was outside, the cold night air biting against her skin. Her dress felt heavy, suffocating. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she gripped the edge of a stone railing, trying to steady herself. Richard had a child. Richard had a child. The words repeated in her mind, over and over, until they blurred into nothing. She had spent years believing in him, trusting him. She had imagined their future, their family. And all this time he had already started one, with someone else. Amelia. His voice shattered the fragile silence. She turned slowly, finding him standing a few feet away, his face etched with anguish. "I didn't know," he said, his voice rough, desperate. "You have to believe me." She let out a breathless, humorless laugh. "Believe you?" Her eyes burned. "Richard, I was about to marry you, and you never told me about her. About him." "I didn't know about him," he repeated, stepping closer. "I swear." "But you knew about her." The accusation hung between them, sharp as a knife. Richard's jaw tightened. "It was over before we ever met. She left. I never heard from her again. Until tonight." He ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. "I don't know why she waited this long, but I need to know the truth just as much as you do." Amelia swallowed hard. She wanted to believe him, but doubt was a poison, spreading fast. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard's eyes darkened with something raw. "Amelia, please." She shook her head, stepping back. "I need time." He didn't stop her, and for the first time since she had met him, she walked away, not knowing if she would ever come back. Amelia spent days in silence. The walls of her apartment felt smaller than ever, closing in on her with every passing hour. She avoided her phone, ignored the messages, the missed calls. She wasn't ready. Wasn't ready to face Richard. Wasn't ready to face the truth. A child. His child. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the little boy's face, his golden curls, his blue eyes, so much like Richard's. And then she saw Elena standing beside him, her expression unreadable. She needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. She found Elena at a small cafe on the quieter side of the city. The woman looked exhausted, her once perfect posture slightly slumped, dark circles shadowing her green eyes. "You came," Elena said, setting down her cup. Amelia sat across from her, folding her hands on the table to stop them from shaking. "I need to know the truth." Elena sighed. "I never meant to ruin your wedding. But you did." Amelia's voice was steady, but inside, she was unraveling. Elena looked away. "I didn't have a choice." "Why now?" Amelia pressed. "Why not 6 years ago? Why not before I walked down that aisle?" A long pause, then finally Elena spoke. "Because I was scared." Her fingers curled around her cup. "I was young. I didn't know what to do. Richard and I were over before I even found out I was pregnant." Amelia's throat tightened. "And you never told him?" "I tried," Elena admitted. "Once, but he was already building a new life. I convinced myself he was better off not knowing, that we were better off. Until now." Elena exhaled slowly. "I'm sick, Amelia." She hesitated before adding, "It's serious." A chill ran down Amelia's spine. "I need to make sure my son has someone," Elena continued. "That's why I came back, not for revenge, not to hurt you." Amelia searched her face for any sign of deception, but all she saw was exhaustion. She had spent days hating this woman, but now, sitting across from her, all she felt was something unexpected. Pity. Elena wasn't a villain. She was just a mother trying to protect her son, and suddenly Amelia wasn't sure what she hated more, the lie that had been kept from her, or the truth she now had to face. Richard had never felt so powerless. For days, he had given Amelia space, waiting for a call that never came. The silence between them felt heavier than any argument could have been, but he couldn't wait any longer. He found her sitting on a park bench, staring at the pond, lost in thought. She didn't look surprised when he sat beside her. "I talked to Eleanor," she said after a long silence. Richard's jaw tightened. "And?" "She told me everything." The weight in his chest grew heavier. "And do you believe her?" Amelia exhaled, shaking her head. "I don't think she's lying. She turned to him then, her gaze searching his face. "But I need to hear it from you." Richard took a slow breath. "Eleanor and I were never meant to last. We were young, careless. When she left, I thought that was the end of it. I never knew about the baby." He looked down at his hands. "If I had, things would have been different." Amelia studied him carefully. "Would they?" His gaze snapped back to hers. "Of course." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned back to the water. "I wanted to hate her," she admitted. "But she's just trying to do what's best for him." Richard nodded, his throat tight. "I know." She finally met his eyes again. "So what now?" He hesitated. "I don't know." The truth settled between them. This wasn't just about their wedding anymore. This was about a little boy who had no idea how much his existence had changed everything. And Amelia had a decision to make. Amelia had never felt so uncertain. She had spent days trapped between heartbreak and understanding, between the life she had planned and the one now staring her in the face. But in the end, the choice wasn't about Richard. It was about the little boy with blue eyes and golden curls. She knocked on the door of Richard's apartment, her pulse steady, her resolve clear. When he opened it, the tension in his shoulders eased just slightly at the sight of her. "You came," he said quietly. She nodded. "I needed time, but I also needed to see him." Richard stepped aside, and there he was, standing in the living room, clutching a small toy in his hands. The boy looked at her with cautious curiosity. She took a deep breath and crouched to his level. "Hi." He hesitated, then offered a small, shy smile. "Hi." Her chest tightened. She had been so afraid of this moment. But now that it was here, it felt right. She looked up at Richard, her voice steady. "I don't know what this means for us, but I know that he needs you." Richard's expression softened. "And what about you?" She glanced at the little boy again, then back at him. "I think," she said slowly, "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." A few months had passed, but the moment still felt surreal. The venue was different this time, smaller, more intimate. No chandeliers, no grand ballrooms, just warm lights and the quiet murmur of people who truly mattered. Amelia stood in front of Richard once more, but this time there were no secrets between them, no unspoken truths lingering in the air. Just them. Richard took her hands, his grip steady, his blue eyes filled with something deeper than before. "Are you sure?" he asked softly. She smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything." The officiant spoke, but Amelia barely heard him. All she could focus on was the man in front of her, the man who had made mistakes but had chosen to face them, and the little boy sitting in the front row, his tiny hands folded neatly in his lap, watching them with quiet excitement. When the vows were exchanged, there were no interruptions, no unexpected voices calling out, no shadows from the past, just a future waiting to begin. And when Richard kissed her, Amelia knew, this time, it was forever.